As much as we can say that there is a story about Bigfoot in many, many places, it certainly seems like if you were to map all of the different kinds of Bigfoot sightings over the year, you would find some pretty easy cross-referencing. In this particular map here on ArcGIS, which is a GPS website, and the dots on the map are crowdsourced so-called Bigfoot sightings. You can certainly see how there are some hotspots, and those hotspots tend to correspond pretty much to the kind of natural environment that exists. So there's obviously a lot in the Pacific Northwest around Washington, and that's your Sasquatch type of character. There's also a little bit more to the south in Bigfoot, and quite a few actually on the East Coast in the forests of the in the woodlands of the Northeast. So, in as much as we can say that there's a preponderance of Bigfoot in the United States, we can also see how it follows pretty much some kind of population pattern. And of course, this population pattern is a very obvious correlation to the population that exists there. There's a lot more people on the eastern side of the country and on the very west coast than there are in the center. So, yes, there is such a thing as a Bigfoot that is everywhere. But as we have talked about this week, it also has to do with this fact that there is the unknown out there and what that unknown represents. And it is kind of a weird thing for us now to think about how these kinds of sightings correspond to a logical relation, whether it's a logical relation to the environment or to the unknown of some sort. There seems to be a way in which people are receiving this idea of Bigfoot very differently. And a good example of that is this description here of Vernon Reynolds, who pointed out in 1967 how people became much more widely aware of the gorillas. And we mentioned gorillas earlier this week, of course. The discovery of the gorilla made an enormous impact on both public and scientists in Europe and the United States, much more than the discovery of other apes, and perhaps more than the discovery of other animals. There were several reasons for this. First, the discovery came late, when the era of modern science was already well underway, so that the techniques already existing for evaluating the new find and placing it among the apes as a close relative of man. Second, the huge gorilla had quote-unquote monster appeal for an imaginative public. Here was a new monster and one the scientists approve of. We shall see in Chapter 10 how things developed. Third, although the gorilla was described before the publication of Darwin's work, these and the furious am I ape or man argument they triggered off helped to keep the gorilla in the forefront of people's minds. Today, the gorilla certainly still ranks as the most fascinating of the apes, even if, as a survey has shown, we are far more fond of the young chimpanzee. So the gorilla as a shape, as a character, has a very specific aesthetic appeal for a lot of people, and Bigfoot seems to fit within that mold. And the discovery of the new gorillas, as they are a reality of some sort, as opposed to the mythical character that appears along the text, made it have that quote-unquote monster appeal, as is mentioned. So, in as much as we can think of this monster appeal and this connection with Darwin's evolution, and of course, thinking of ourselves as a relative to the chimps and or the gorillas makes that conversation a much larger conversation, not just about the gorillas themselves, but all the other great apes. There are, of course, great apes outside of Americas, and certainly we have talked about these folk tales of large ape being that have been associated with the kind of Bigfoot character that we know. This book here, On the Tracks of Unknown Animals, is kind of credited with the invention of what we are now calling cryptozoology, looking at weird-looking animals. And part of this book is covering some, in fact, weird-looking animals like pangolins and even badgers and other kind of, more or less mystical things like the sloth, as you can see on the top, or a dodo, or kind of big cats, but it also covers the large apes. For example, this ape called Orang Pendek. You can see how the name comes pretty close to orangutan, except this is Orang Pendek. William Martin, who was the secretary at the residence of Bacolod in Sumatra and edited an English edition of Marco Polo in 1818. Oh, remember Marco Polo, the guy who saw a unicorn? thought that this fable arose from the actual existence of two types of native in Sumatra hinterland who lived in the woods and avoided all contacts with the other inhabitants. They were known as Orang Kubu and Orang Gugu. The first were fairly numerous, especially in the country where Palembang and Jambi. They had their own language and ate everything: deer, elephants, rhinoceroses, unicorns, dogs, snakes, and monkeys. The Gugu were much rarer and were covered with long hair. Marten Orang Kubu are very well known today. They are usually given the Dutch spelling Kobo, but and are a tribe of natives who live in the mountainous forest in the southeast of the island, in fact, exactly where Marten puts them. So this early explorer found a tribe of apes who turned out to be humans. The Orangugu seem at first to be orangutans, for, as Bontius remarked, the Javanese maintain that these animals can speak but refuse to do so for fear of being made to work. And now we are crossing over the domain of superstition. We have these human-like animals or ape-like humans, whatever they are, who have a magical way to communicate with people, and they are scared, in fact, of working. Same Orang Pendek. The natives insist that the orang pendek is not any of the three species of gibbon to be found in Sumatra, nor is it orangutan, though people ignorant of the Malay language has often been misled into thinking the two names are connected because of the first word is the same and that the natives therefore believe in several species of orangutan. Actually, orang merely means man or man-like creature, whether it is used in such phrases as orang pendek, little man, orang Malayu, Malay man, and orangutan, man of the woods. Incidentally, orangutan, a frequent misspelling, means man in debt. So this monkey that is also a man, also in the local language, has something to do with a human-like shape. The same way that today we would talk about primates having a human-like shape if we followed the original scientific nomenclature, because primates are the prime form of animals, and primates count, as we have talked about, the humans as much as they count the apes, because the humans are apes, of course, and all of this conversation really is just one large conversation about languages, sounds like. But it's not just about language, of course, it is also about that aesthetic sense that I mentioned a second ago. If you think of your imagination and what you picture when you think of a quote unquote man, or when you think of an ape or of a monkey, you can see how there is a pretty large amount of confusion, especially in the context of science as we are doing it today, because the most ancient form of humans as we know them, we only have bones. We don't have any kind of idea of just how much hair they have, how much flesh they have. We can interpolate that based on what we know today of genetics. And we'll talk about technology a little bit more in a second, but also it is kind of a role for us to fill in the blanks in our knowledge. Here's an example of how this has played out very literally in the context of our science. Sinanthropus pekinensis, David Black in 1927 found some fossils, isolated teeth, first skull, and all around the 27 in 1928. So way before we had any kind of idea what this human might look like. Early materials include fragments of 14 skulls, 14 lower jaws, 148 teeth, remarkably little of the rest of the skeleton. Material lost during World War II, of course, so now we have lost the physical evidence. Post-war finds consist of only a few teeth and one lower jaw. Isolated teeth of Sinanthropus were found among dragon's teeth in pharmacies in Canton and Hong Kong. This material originated from unknown sites in southern China. Further finds show that Black had been right to consider the controversial find a new type of man. From the 1928 skull, he was able to prove further that Sinanthropus must have been a relative of the Javanese Pithecanthropus. Unfortunately, Dubois did not accept Black's conclusion and continued to look upon Sinanthropus as a degenerate Neanderthal man. All further scientific discussions with him foundered in obstinacy. So we have these scientists who are fighting over the meaning of what is a Pithecanthropus, what is a Sinanthropus. Again, this is a matter of nomenclature, scientific nomenclature especially, but also a matter of money, a matter of record, a matter of acknowledgement. If somebody found another version of an existing man, then the existing form of man would be a little bit less valuable, and then there's a matter of prestige between these researchers, etc. This is especially true for today, now that we have a much larger conversation about the value of science and stuff like that. But this conversation here revolves around Sinanthropus and Pithecanthropus, or today there is the possibility of Australopithecus. Again, all of these different animals are more or less related to us to a certain extent. If you are interested in that, you can read about it more on the internet, if you will. But this is, a way in which the knowledge that we have of science is cross-referencing with the knowledge that we have of our data, and that includes stuff like bones, stuff like teeth, stuff like tissue, but not necessarily an actual shape of what this thing is. Now, we are talking about, million-year-old types of humans or human ancestors. And so, having some kind of legitimate proof in this context would seem to be very valuable, but we don't have any kind of physical proof of what these humans might have looked like. Here, there is this find that happens in British Columbia in Yale in 1882 of a strange creature. The report tells us, so this is 1882, the report tells us in the immediate vicinity of number 4 tunnel, this is around the mine, situated 20 miles above this village, are bluffs of rock which have hitherto been unsurmountable, but one Monday morning last were successfully scaled by a person working in the mine. They find next to the mine a number of gentlemen for Lighton Point east of the place who, after considerable trouble and perjured climbing, succeeded in capturing a creature which may truly be called half man and half beast. Jacko, as the creature has been called by his capturers, is something of the gorilla type, standing about 4 foot 7 inches, I suppose. So 7 inches in height and weighing 127 pounds. So in terms of the dimensions here, we are much more close to the chimpanzee type of characters, but there are not supposed to be any kind of chimpanzees in Vancouver, around Vancouver and the Pacific Northwest. So they find this human-like, ape-like character, half-elf, and they don't know what to do with him. Now, they are miners, they're not scientists, and the amount of data that they can gather about what this thing is obviously limited, and especially because this thing appears to be pretty beat up and eventually escapes them. They found more traces of it, a small store about half a mile west of the tunnel during the past 2 years. I've mentioned having seen a curious creature at different points between camps 13 and 17, but no attention was paid to their remarks as people came to the conclusion that they had either seen a bear or a stray Indian dog. Who can unravel the mystery that now surrounds Jacko? Does he belong to a species hitherto unknown on this part of the continent, or is he really what the trained men first thought he was, a crazy Indian? Oh, once again, the problem is that this person could be a person, just a foreigner, or a foreigner to these people who are in fact foreign to that particular area. We don't know. We don't have any kind of data, and especially when you don't have the scientific method to prove who this person is, you have a much larger concern about identifying such tracks. And certainly because this is all happening against the background of a very loose time for science, it is very difficult to find what this thing might be. Like, as you can see, this particular article is calling it a British Columbia gorilla, of course, because it seems to be much closer to an animal, but the local people thought it might have been a quote-unquote crazy Indian. Now, the scientist of the day went to visit and eventually figured out that it was probably not a Bigfoot type of character, because there is, there's the area where there's a tradition of Bigfoot. But today, some people are pulling back these kinds of archives and seeing this as the Bigfoot. So what we have from nature, from the results of that, is mostly secondary evidence, such as tracks, foot tracks especially, which are probably very important to the naming of this creature as quote-unquote Bigfoot. This picture here, dated from 1969, shows how some of these early Bigfoot hunters made some kind of casts of the footprints that they found in the snow. Now, footprints in the snow, of course, if you have seen them before, you might have seen them around campus right now, are not particularly trustworthy or reliable or really exemplary of the way people walk. But these became emblematic of what they call cripplefoot, or the Bosberg cripple, a apparently misshapen track that was found in the area and that was cast, and as a result of that, used for the identification of what this animal may be. He was taxidermied by a local person. He was found with a bunch of the local population. Of course, there's all kinds of discussion as to how reliable this evidence is, but today it is counted, especially by Bigfoot aficionado, as a evidence, as a trustworthy evidence of what Bigfoot is or what Bigfoot might be. Now, today there should be another conversation about DNA, of course, because a cast of a footprint is not quite a reliable evidence. We have talked about this being a secondary or even third-hand evidence. DNA would be pretty useful, but at this point in time, there is no evidence that would point us to a DNA. So there are people that are finding pretty regularly tufts of hair or even scat poop that they are trying to analyze and hopefully find traces of something that might be not human or animal as a knowledge, but pretty often the results come out to being bears or animals of some kind of sort, sometimes human, but so far no evidence of what the Bigfoot is, if it is not one of those things. Technology also provided us with images, and this is the most commonly available form of quote unquote proof for Bigfoot, a video made by Patterson and Gimlin, published in I think in the 1960s. Patterson and Gimlin were aware of the story of Bigfoot. They read it in a magazine. They went looking for Bigfoot for a while, and for about 10 years, they went looking and never really found any kind of valuable data. Then they started making movies to make people more aware of their mission and to make people more aware um, of what Bigfoot is, to find more, drum up more interest and perhaps funding for their own research. On one of these movies, when they were filming, they got this video here of what they call Bigfoot. Now, this is again coming in a time when video is not necessarily available, and especially clear video and all that, so the technology is new, but once again it fills up this imaginary gap, and technology is helping, or at least contributing to filling the gaps of imagination that we might have. And certainly this kind of character here looks a lot like what people imagine Bigfoot to be. So you get into this cycle of confirmation of what people see, what people think about, and how those things might look like one or the other. Now, if you ask Patterson and Gimlin, they had slightly different accounts of what Bigfoot was and how tall he was, between 6 and 8 feet, and how close they got. This is obviously pretty far away. Again, if you want to read the whole story about that, you can definitely do so. But this particular movie is also very much considered to be an important proof of what Bigfoot might be, including to somebody like Grover Krantz, pictured here in this video. Grover Krantz is an anthropologist who did some of the research on Bigfoot, trying to make sense of what this creature is. He saw the Patterson Gimlin movie, and to him that was an impulse into looking more into this phenomenon. He did not quite trust it up until he died. He knew about it and he tried to prove it, including trying to reproduce the walk. And to him, the way that this Bigfoot walks is not human. And so he tried to show how this works, of course. The reading for this week is by Grover Krantz, because it's not just about the way that they walk, but it is also looking at the way in which the evidence might stack up in a scientific way. And if you look at it, this is kind of a boring article, of course. It's not any kind of glamorous thing, but it is the measurements of the foot, and especially the cripple foot that I mentioned just a second ago. So trying to make sense of the available evidence in terms of what is human, what is not human, what is relatable, what is not relatable, what makes sense to us as people interested in the human and the non-human. Here, this photo showing a person that seems to have too big of a stride to be the Bosberg Sasquatch or the Cripplefoot Sasquatch. Is certainly a bigger part of this conversation. But probably the biggest point of contention at this point is exactly what do we do if we could find that evidence? The only significant way in which you could exemplify what a Bigfoot actually is would be to capture it. And if the capture does not go easily, it seems like the only way, the only legitimate way to make sure that this thing is actually a Bigfoot would be to kill him. And certainly there is a whole subculture of Bigfoot that is considering how to kill Bigfoot because that would be the most reliable way, the most foolproof way to know that Bigfoot is Bigfoot, as opposed to, kind of keeping him at bay and not being studied firsthand. And this is a moral dilemma, certainly for a lot of people who are interested in Bigfoot slash Sasquatch slash any of those, because on the one hand, you would try to preserve the life of something so unique, but on the other hand, and if we are looking at it from a scientific point of view, a dead Bigfoot is a lot better than no Bigfoot, if it comes to that conclusion. So, um, if we are looking at the meaning of Bigfoot itself or Sasquatch or whatever it is, we are also looking at what we are doing with our science, how to approach these kind of unique, but also kind of rare, but also kind of valuable forms of data that we can see. Technically speaking, most of our research methods are pretty destructive because that's how science works, especially for stuff that is buried. So in archaeology, for example, you will have to remove the exact context of where you find a material. And so removing the context means documenting out of it, but also removing it from the actual place where it was. So, there's the possibility of affecting the material that you find. If you are asking somebody questions in a questionnaire, that makes it a very artificial process, and people are likely to be affected emotionally by the way you are asking a lot of questions, which could yield some bad answers. If you are doing any kind of research in this sense, it is a very real question in terms of the methods that you are using, that you are not, in fact, destroying the kind of thing that you are looking at. So it is also part of the conversation today and what to do with these kinds of humans slash non-humans, because the humane way to treat a human would be not to kill it, but the scientific kind of cold approach would be to kill it. And it is a very legitimate question, something that especially applies to Bigfoot, not necessarily happening to the rest of the people that we'll talk about